The slavery era remains one of history's most forgettable chapters, and a sad reminder of the lowly depths to which our humanity once sank. It was a terrible period marked by great cruelty to black people at the hands of their white masters, and this sad era still leaves a sour taste to date. Black men and women forcefully uprooted from their homes and cultures were brought on slave ships to the Americas, where they faced some of the most challenging conditions imaginable, and the stories of the victims and the survivors remain today. While many of the ills and cruel treatment handed out to enslaved black people during this era are documented to large extents, a few of them might have gone under the radar. One of the many less talked about ills that marked the slavery era is the untold horrors suffered by enslaved black men in the hands of their female masters. The truth is that some white women took an active part in the humiliation of their black slaves. In fact, a few of them took delight in dealing very harshly with their male slaves as a mark of authority. In this article, we'll shed some light on the less talked about cruelty and horrors untold experienced by black men as perpetuated by none other than white women. Before we go on, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on your notification button. Now, straight to the subject matter of our video. The slavery era left a trail of unimaginable suffering, hardships, and difficulties in its wake when it ended legally in the late 19th century. Many of the harrowing stories of the enslaved black person's experiences in that era have endured till this day and are often told as a reminder of an inglorious past. These stories account for many periods of hunger, whipping, sexual violations, and hard labor. Black men and women had their fair share of cruel treatment, with the men mainly at the brunt of all the horrors unleashed by their white masters. Many of these men faced harsh, everyday realities, from endless floggings for the slightest perceived crimes to forced hunger, sleep deprivation, and intense labor. Their living conditions were nothing to write home about, and their masters treated them like physical possessions to be tossed about at their whims. While the white male masters did all the dirty work, the women were not left behind. Some of the white women in the slavery era were huge culprits in the inhuman treatment meted out to enslaved black men. These women turned their male slaves into work tools and held them as possessions as a mark of their wealth and standing in society. Some of the more unfortunate men were converted to sex slaves by the wives of their white masters before they would be discarded once the women had their fill. While this ugly past is mostly concealed in history, there's no doubt it was a recurring theme in this shameful past. To fully understand the extent of the horrors that enslaved black men suffered at the hands of their female masters, we'll discuss 7 critical points in this video. These points will provide much-needed context and hopefully shed more light on the subject. You probably thought that the men did all the buying and owning of enslaved people in the past, but nothing could be further from the truth. A staggering 40% of enslavers in America were women. This is no mere statistics, despite the weight implications that it might portend. The slavery era was marked by white women who were active participants in the slavery market and not mere bystanders, as you might expect. White women argued and bargained for prices in the slave market. They sold and bought enslaved people and took as many homes as they could afford, while they took enslaved women to carry out specific domestic duties. They also took home enslaved men, sometimes in their numbers. Many of the prominent white women of the slave era had a significant number of enslaved people in their possession. While they made these enslaved people work their plantations and do other domestic duties, they also reserved a few for the most repulsive roles: sex slaves. While female enslavers were not as popular as their male counterparts, a few of them made quite the name for themselves in this sordid business. Some of the most notable female enslavers include Sally Yates, Eleanor Atherton, Elizabeth Bannister, and a few White House First Ladies, including Martha Washington most notably. It is often said that while George Washington had 18 enslaved people at the time he wed Martha Washington, his wife had a whipping of 84 enslaved people, many of them men. The southern region was notorious for its booming slave scene for women all over the Americas. The men in that era tended to reward their wives with more enslaved people than land, so they empowered their wives to accrue as many enslaved people as possible. The enslaved people were a mark of their prosperity and societal status, and the more they had at the time, the merrier. These women took an active part in the slave market, enslaving people that they could pass on to their daughters. Some of the Southern elite women contributed to the passing of a notoriously cruel law known as the Black Code. Under the Black Code, black people were stripped of their voting rights and barred from assuming positions in the jury and state militias. The women were forced to do domestic chores while they were condemned to forced labor. Because of the power granted to these women, they did the most unimaginable things to their male slaves. They asserted their influence and power by humiliating their male slaves, and their husbands would not as much as raise a finger. White Southern women not only forced their black male slaves to do hard labor, they also forced them into sexual slavery. It is no hidden fact that white women took advantage of their black slaves in the past, but what is not known is the extent to which it happened and the roles played by the men in the picture. However, some white women in the South, by virtue of their position and with the backing of their partners, sexually violated their male slaves in the past. While this is a very bleak tale in history that takes great pains to revisit, it is undoubtedly a point in case to the ugly realities of the Southern slavery scene. The Ku Klux Klan is a notoriously discriminatory and brutal group that committed several grave acts in the past, especially in the slavery era. The group was populated by several notorious white supremacists who believed that they held a natural power and influence over any other race on earth, especially black people. They had serious political and socio-cultural influence in the past, and their female actors and members interest us in this video. During the slavery era, many white people joined the KKK, perhaps to reinforce their self-acclaimed superiority. Among this teeming rank of racially prejudiced people were several Southern women who not only joined, but took an active part in the bitter politics and societal affairs of the group. These women joined the clamor to enforce several burdens and restrictions on black people and their respective communities. After joining forces with their male counterparts to implement the brutal black codes, some of these white women went on to perpetrate even greater hostility against black people, especially black men. For these women, the opportunity to lead over black men represented a great symbol of feminism and women empowerment in the most uncanny way. They formed the WKK, the women's wing of the group, and even had a hierarchy system where women climbed the ranks to reach such roles as imperial commander. The WKKK group had a great impact on society, impacting political campaigns, schools, churches, and even forming desperate clubs and groups within the KKK. Their shared ideology of white supremacy united them, and the women used their dominance over their male slaves to make massive statements in the past. Women like Lulu Maxwell and Daisy Douglas led the WKKK at some point, which is a testament to the group's influence in the past. In those days, women were not ordinarily highly esteemed in society. They were relegated to domestic roles and barred from voting, public engagement, and many other jobs that were the sole reserve of men. Women in those times were hardly seen unaccompanied in public by their male minders, so they spent most of their time at home, attending to their children and other domestic activities. They couldn't own lands and many possessions, and were not qualified to get an inheritance for the most part. While these women were left to tend to domestic duties when their husbands left home, the enslaved people were, as you'd expect, at the mercy of the women. Some of these white women subjected their slaves to the most challenging living conditions. They made them work long hours without respite or reward, but that was not the worst part. Some of these women sexually exploited their male slaves to no end. They would invite these men to their chambers and command them to have sex with them, and the men mostly had no other choice than to oblige. It is admittedly tough to envisage the fact that enslaved men were at the receiving end of sexual violation in slavery-era America, with women at the receiving end. In some cases, the white men even approved of these acts, giving the women power to violate the black men in their household. At this time in America, the judicial system was rigged against the black man, so there was no entertaining any complaints of rape or forced sex against black men. The men were forced to endure this reality in silence for the most part, hence a seeming lack of account for this dark part of history. The majority of the black men in slavery-era America were condemned to a lifetime of labor in plantations where they would toil to no end in sight. While the white men and lords of the houses at the time were mainly in charge of the day-to-day running of these plantations, some women were much more than passive observers. History is replete with accounts of women who were known enforcers at the plantations, with their whips in hand to deliver cruelty to the workforce. These women were severe aggressors, taking the reins over the plantations while their husbands watched from a distance. In some parts of America, again in the southern part, the women took lead roles in the plantations. Women in that era and place could own lands and other possessions, so they invested in the slave markets and grew their plantations. The women were often no less brutal than their male counterparts, and they made life incredibly hard for their male slaves, working tirelessly in the plantations. Women bought as many enslaved men as they could afford for the plantation job, and with some bit of help, deployed them to work under the most challenging conditions. For these women, enslaved black men were an accessory, a valuable work tool that they would utilize to the best of their efforts. Given that some of these women had the right to own property and cultivate lands of their own, they pulled all the stops to increase yield in their plantations, often at the expense of the male enslaved people. In slavery-era America, wet nurses stand out as one of the most cruel pieces of innovation, most notably championed by white women. White women at the time would forcefully uproot newly nursing black mothers from their babies so they could, in turn, nurse the white women's babies. In some very terrible cases, black women were made to be impregnated by their male counterparts, so they could produce an endless supply of nursing mothers or wet nurses for white women to draw from. The black men were forced to impregnate their female counterparts, often with threats of violence, and their white female masters usually supervised the entire process. Many times, the white male masters would do the job of impregnating the black women, and at certain times, other white women would insist that this job be left to them to carry out. The American Civil War was fought on certain fronts, including the argument for and against the abolition of slavery. While a few notable white women like Lydia Maria Child and Maria Weston Chapman fought gallantly on the side of their black counterparts to push for the abolition of slavery, many other white women stood on the opposing side. History professor Stephanie Jones Rogers tells us all in her book about the roles white women played in the slavery era through the Civil War era, and she notably recounts that several white women stood against the efforts of the abolitionist movement. In fact, some other women like Margaret Mitchell would later go on to misrepresent the facts of slavery, even describing it in more flattering terms. Like many of their counterparts, these women felt that the abolitionist movement threatened America's economic stability and the long-established racial order prevailing at the time. The women were known enslavers, and their stance on the anti-slavery drive only asserted their thoughts on slavery. Many women actively worked against abolishing slavery, primarily due to the gains they made from their male slaves. White women drew great wealth and societal esteem from the sweat and toil of their male slaves. So once there was the possibility of losing this source of wealth, they opposed it with all their power. In the North, and particularly in the South, some of these women were united by their shared goal of continuing the slavery practice, and a name stands out during this time: Martha Gibbs. Martha Gibbs, like several other Southern women enslavers, took no pleasure in seeing Union troops liberate black enslaved people in the trail of the abolitionist wave spreading rapidly across America. So she took some of her slaves to Texas, where she held them at gunpoint and forced them to work. As expected, many of these black people were able-bodied men who toiled endlessly to give women like Martha Gibbs the wealth and standing in society they enjoyed. It wasn't until 1866, 1 year after slavery was formally abolished, that these people were released from her grip. Her story, along with countless untold others, marks the role that white women played during and after the Civil War as part of the resistance to the abolition of the slavery practice. While this video does not seek to reopen wounds that have scarcely healed or to provoke a new argument, it merely seeks to bring some previously concealed truths to light, that women actively participated in the slave business. The goal is not to stir up a fresh conversation, but to explore a perspective often overlooked as part of efforts to represent the slavery era properly. The fact is that white women were not mere bystanders or onlookers in the series of injustices meted out to black people, the majority of whom were black men. While black enslaved women were undoubtedly subjected to grave horrors, including sexual violation, their male counterparts also received similar treatment. This treatment includes forced labor under the most challenging conditions, food and sleep deprivation, inhuman treatment, and even sexual violation. The sex exploitation of black enslaved men by white women is a lesser-known part of the harsh experience lived by black men in the slavery era. But it is also very genuine and accurate, and is a grim detail in the endless trail of horrors that America's sordid past leaves in its wake. Hopefully, America and the rest of the world can put this forgettable past exactly where it belongs, well behind it, and look forward to many long years of shared humanity. This is where we draw today's video to a close. We hope you've learned something from our video and look forward to having you next time. To our new viewers, please like and share this video and turn on notifications for this channel. Thanks for watching.